Every evening, Atlas stopped outside the same white house, and every evening, Caleb Rowe told himself it meant nothing. A dog could favor a smell, a shadow, a bend in the sidewalk where the wind gathered old leaves and chimney smoke. A Marine could tell himself all kinds of things when he did not want to believe the world was still trying to speak to him. But Atlas was not an ordinary dog, and Caleb knew it. The German shepherd walked with the quiet discipline of something shaped by commands, memory, and loss. His sable coat caught the last amber light of Oregon evenings, dark along the spine, warmer at the chest, and his eyes held that deep gold color Caleb had once seen in desert sunrises, beautiful only because they arrived after a long night. They had been taking the same route for 3 weeks, down Harbor Lane, past the church with the cracked bell, past the little grocery with pumpkins stacked outside, past the mailboxes leaning like tired soldiers along the curb. And each time they reached the white house at the end of Willow Creek Road, Atlas slowed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply stopped, as if an invisible hand had rested on his chest. The house itself did not look haunted. That was what bothered Caleb most. It was clean, small, and old, with white siding softened by rain, green shutters, a narrow porch, and a maple tree standing bare in the yard like it had given up all its secrets too early. A porch light burned every evening, even before dark, casting a pale circle over the steps. The curtains on the second floor stayed drawn. The mailbox carried one faded name in black letters. M. Whitaker. Caleb had never seen anyone come out. He had never seen a car in the driveway. Still, the lawn was trimmed, the walkway swept, and a little ceramic angel sat beside the front steps, its wings chipped by weather. The first night, Caleb tugged the leash and said, "Come on, boy." Atlas obeyed, but he looked back once. The second night, he sat down. The third, he lifted his nose toward the second-floor window and breathed in slowly, so still that Caleb could hear the faint ticking of the dog's tags against the collar. By the 10th night, the air had turned colder. A wet wind moved in from the coast, carrying the smell of salt, cedar, and rain waiting beyond the hills. Caleb pulled his jacket tighter and watched Atlas step off the sidewalk onto the edge of the lawn. "Atlas," he warned softly. The dog did not move. His ears stood sharp, his tail lowered. Then came the sound Caleb had not heard from him before. A low, broken whine. Not fear, not hunger, something closer to grief. Caleb felt it travel through the leash and into his hand. For a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. No cars passed. No porch doors opened. Somewhere far away, a screen door tapped in the wind. Atlas raised one paw and placed it gently on the first wooden step of the white house. Caleb stared at the closed front door, at the dim porch light, at the silent window above. He wanted to walk away. He wanted this to be nothing. But Marines are trained to notice what repeats, and dogs like Atlas do not beg without reason. Caleb swallowed, stepped onto the porch, and lifted his hand. "All right, boy," he whispered. "Let's find out what you know." Then Caleb Rowe knocked. The knock sounded smaller than Caleb expected. 3 dull taps against painted wood, swallowed almost immediately by the wind moving through the bare maple branches behind him. He waited. Atlas did not blink. The German shepherd stood beside his left leg with every muscle held still, his nose angled toward the seam beneath the door, breathing in slow, careful pulls. Caleb had seen that kind of focus before, not in a neighborhood like this, not under a porch light with moths circling the glass, but in places where silence mattered and one wrong assumption could change a life. He knocked again, a little firmer this time. "Mrs. Whitaker," he called, keeping his voice low and respectful. "My name is Caleb Rowe. I live a few blocks over. I am sorry to bother you." Nothing answered. No footsteps. No television murmuring through the walls. No chairs shifting across a wooden floor. Only the soft patter of rain beginning to touch the porch roof, each drop arriving like a warning. Caleb looked toward the street, half expecting a neighbor to step outside and ask what he was doing. The houses along Willow Creek Road remained dark and quiet, their windows glowing with the private warmth of families finishing dinner, washing dishes, turning down beds. Ordinary life. The kind Caleb had forgotten how to enter without feeling like a stranger. Atlas leaned forward and gave one short breath against the door. Not a bark, not a command, a plea held behind the teeth. Caleb crouched and laid a hand between the dog's shoulders. The fur there was damp from mist, warm underneath, steady as a living oath. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Atlas turned his head just enough to meet Caleb's eyes, and something in that look pulled an old ache loose in Caleb's chest. He had found Atlas 8 months earlier at a small rescue outside Salem, a place that smelled of bleach, wet concrete, and second chances. The dog had been listed as a retired working shepherd with incomplete records, calm temperament, no known aggression, responds well to structure. That was what the paper said. It did not mention the way Atlas watched doors before entering rooms, or how he woke from sleep at distant thunder and moved straight to Caleb's bedside without being called. It did not mention how he refused to eat until Caleb sat down too, as if meals were not meals unless both survivors were accounted for. Back then, Caleb had not wanted a dog. He had wanted quiet. He had wanted a life small enough to manage. But the first time Atlas pressed his head against Caleb's knee, the Marine understood that quiet could become a cage if nothing warm breathed inside it. Now, on that porch, with rain threading down the white siding, Caleb felt the same pull he had felt the day he signed the adoption papers. A responsibility he had not asked for, but could not walk away from. He stood and tried the doorbell. Somewhere inside the house, a faint chime rang once, tired and distant. Then the silence returned heavier than before. Atlas stepped sideways toward the living room window, sniffed along the sill, and froze. Caleb followed his gaze. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, he could see only a slice of darkness, the edge of a lamp, a framed photograph on a table, and dust floating in the porch light. Then, from somewhere inside, came a sound so faint Caleb almost mistook it for the house settling. A soft thud. Atlas's ears snapped forward. Caleb's breath stopped. He moved closer to the door and pressed his palm against the wood. "Mrs. Whitaker," he called again, louder now. "Are you all right in there?" For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, thin as a thread pulled through a wall, a voice answered. Not words at first, just a fragile sound, human and afraid, rising from deep inside the house. Atlas gave one sharp whine and placed both front paws on the door. Caleb's training took over before his doubt could catch up. He reached for his phone, but the screen showed one fading bar, then none. The storm had moved in fast over the coastal hills, dimming the street, bending the maple limbs, turning the porch light into a trembling halo. Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the locked door. Every rule in his head told him to wait, to call again from the street, to find a neighbor. But the sound came once more from within, weaker this time, and it carried a single word that changed everything. "Help." Caleb's face went still. He slipped the leash around his wrist, braced one hand against the frame, and lowered his voice to the dog beside him. "Stay close, Atlas." The German shepherd did not move away. He stood ready, eyes bright, as if he had been waiting all these evenings for Caleb to finally understand. Caleb did not force the door right away. Even with the rain thickening and that single word still ringing in his chest, he made himself breathe, made himself think like the man he had been trained to be. He stepped back from the porch, moved to the side window, and tried to see farther into the living room without touching the glass. The curtains blocked most of the view, but a narrow opening showed an overturned cane near the base of a hallway table, its curved handle catching the pale porch light like a question mark. That was enough. Caleb returned to the door and called out again, calm but stronger. "Mrs. Whitaker, I am coming in to help you. I am a United States Marine. My name is Caleb Rowe. I am not here to hurt you." He waited one heartbeat, then two, hoping for permission. The answer came as a breath more than a voice. "Please." Caleb looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd stood with his paws planted, eyes fixed, not excited, not confused, only ready. Caleb searched the porch quickly and spotted an old clay planter beside the ceramic angel. Beneath it was a small metal key, dark with weather. For a second, he almost smiled at the mercy of ordinary habits. He unlocked the door, eased it open, and the smell of the house drifted out into the storm. Lavender soap, old paper, cold coffee, something lonely underneath, like rooms that had been kept clean but not truly lived in for a long time. "Stay with me," Caleb whispered, and Atlas crossed the threshold first, nose low, moving with careful purpose. The entryway was narrow, lined with framed photographs and a small wooden table holding unopened mail. A lamp glowed weakly in the living room, throwing amber light over crocheted blankets, stacked books, and a recliner angled toward a silent television. Nothing looked chaotic. That was what made it worse. The house seemed to be holding its breath around one hidden emergency. Atlas moved straight past the living room and into the hallway. Caleb followed, boots quiet on the hardwood floor. "Mrs. Whitaker," he called. A faint sound came from the back of the house. Atlas stopped at the foot of the stairs. There, half in shadow, lay Miriam Whitaker, an elderly woman with silver hair loosened from its pins, one hand resting near the lowest step, the other clutching the sleeve of a pale blue cardigan. She was conscious, but weak, her face drawn with exhaustion and relief so sudden it looked almost painful. Caleb knelt beside her immediately. "Ma'am, I am Caleb. Help is here." Miriam blinked at him, then past him. Her eyes found Atlas, and in that instant something changed in the room. Her lips parted. No sound came at first. Atlas stepped closer, slowly, respectfully, as if approaching a memory that might break if startled. He lowered his head until his nose touched the edge of her cardigan. Miriam's fingers trembled, then brushed the fur between his ears. Tears gathered in her eyes before she seemed to understand why. "Anchor," she whispered. Caleb froze. The name fell softly, but it struck the air with the weight of a church bell. Atlas did not pull away. He closed his eyes for half a second, leaning into her hand with a tenderness Caleb had never seen from him before. Caleb checked Miriam as gently as he could, asking simple questions, keeping her talking, making sure she stayed awake. She had slipped on the stairs 2 days earlier, she said, while carrying laundry down from the second floor. The phone had been on the kitchen counter, 10 feet away and a lifetime beyond reach. She had heard the doorbell the night before, but could not make her voice carry. Caleb swallowed hard. Atlas had known. Maybe not in words. Maybe not in any way a person could prove. But he had known enough to stop, night after night, until Caleb listened. The storm rattled the windows as Caleb moved to the kitchen and found a landline mounted beside a calendar filled with careful handwriting. He called for help, gave the address, and returned with a folded blanket from the couch. Miriam watched Atlas the whole time. Her hand rested on his head, as if she feared he might vanish. "That was my son's dog," she said faintly. Caleb adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "Atlas." Miriam looked at him then, confused and grieving all at once. "No," she whispered. His name was Anchor. Atlas lifted his eyes to Caleb, and the house seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the white walls themselves had been waiting years for someone to say that name aloud. The ambulance lights arrived without sirens, red and white washing softly across the rain-slick windows of the little house at the end of Willow Creek Road. Caleb stood back as the paramedics moved around Miriam with practiced calm, asking her name, checking her pulse, wrapping her in warmth, turning the lonely hallway into a place where help had finally arrived. Atlas stayed low beside her, his chin near her hand, and every time one of the responders shifted too quickly, his ears lifted, not with aggression, but with the watchful caution of a guardian who had waited too long to fail now. "He is all right," Caleb told them quietly. He found her. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and gray rain in her hair, glanced down at the German shepherd and nodded as if she understood more than Caleb had said. Miriam never let go of Atlas completely. Even when they lifted her onto the stretcher, her fingers trailed through the fur at his neck until distance forced them apart. "Anchor," she whispered again, her voice breaking into the soft air between them. Atlas gave one low whine, the same sound he had made on the porch, but now it sounded different. Not pleading, answering. Caleb followed them outside beneath the porch roof, rain misting against his face, watching as Miriam was guided into the ambulance. The street had begun to wake. Curtains moved. Porch lights flicked on. A neighbor in a navy bathrobe stood under an umbrella at the edge of the driveway, one hand covering her mouth. Caleb heard questions forming around him, but none of them reached deep enough to matter. All he could think about was the name. Anchor. The dog beside him had another life before him, another person, another home, another hand that had once rested in the same place Caleb rested his now. When the ambulance pulled away, its lights fading into the wet dark, Atlas did not try to follow. He turned instead toward the staircase inside the open house. Caleb noticed it at once. The dog was not finished. "Atlas," he said softly. The German shepherd looked back, amber eyes steady, then stepped inside. Caleb hesitated only a moment before following. The house felt changed after Miriam left, not empty exactly, but exposed, as if the walls had been holding their breath for years and now did not know how to exhale. Rain tapped on the windows. The lamp in the living room hummed faintly. Somewhere upstairs, an old clock ticked with patient insistence. Atlas climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at each step to make sure Caleb was behind him. At the top, the hallway stretched narrow and dim, lined with framed photographs that Caleb had not noticed before. A young man in dress blues. A boy with sandy hair holding a baseball glove. A woman much younger than Miriam standing beside a Christmas tree. And then, halfway down the hall, one photograph stopped Caleb cold. It showed a Marine in desert fatigues kneeling in sunlit dust, laughing as a young German shepherd pressed both paws against his chest. The dog was smaller then, ears too large for his head, but the eyes were the same. Caleb reached toward the frame without touching it. Atlas stood beneath the photograph and lifted his nose, breathing in the glass as if scent could pass through time. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. Unlike the others, this one had no light beneath it. A brass nameplate hung slightly crooked at eye level. Andrew. Atlas sat in front of the door and placed one paw against the wood. Caleb tried the knob. Locked. From downstairs, the wind pushed against the front door, making it creak on its hinges. Caleb should have left the room alone. It was not his house. It was not his grief. But then the old clock inside the room began to ring. One soft chime, then another, delicate and tired, until the hallway filled with the sound of a memory keeping time. 7:17. Caleb saw the hour on his watch and felt the air leave his lungs. That was the time Atlas always stopped outside the White House. Every evening. Every single evening. Caleb looked down at the dog. What happened at 7:17? He whispered. Atlas did not move. He only pressed his forehead to the door, as if the answer was still breathing somewhere on the other side. Caleb stood in the upstairs hallway with one hand resting near the locked door and the other still wrapped around Atlas's leash, though the dog no longer needed restraint. The chimes faded one by one until only rain remained, whispering against the roof, slipping down the gutters, darkening the white siding outside. 7:17. A time should have been simple, a number on a clock, a mark on the evening. But in that house, it felt like a name spoken from another room. Caleb tried the knob again, gently this time, not to open it, only to feel the old brass turn against its limit. Locked. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward a narrow table beneath the hallway window. Caleb followed his gaze. There, beside a small vase of dried lavender, sat a wooden bowl filled with ordinary things. A sewing thimble, 2 loose buttons, a pair of reading glasses, and a key tied to a strip of faded blue ribbon. Caleb stared at it for a long second. You knew, he whispered. Atlas did not move. Caleb picked up the key. The ribbon was soft from age, and when he turned it over, he saw 3 letters written in dark ink that had almost vanished. AWR. He did not know what the R meant, not yet. The key slid into the lock with a small, tired click. Caleb opened the door only a few inches at first, careful as a man stepping into a chapel after years away. The air inside was cooler than the hallway. It smelled of cedar, paper, and the faint dust of things preserved too long. He found the switch on the wall, and a small lamp near the bed came on, filling the room with gold. Andrew Whitaker's room had not been packed away. It had been kept. A neatly made bed with a dark green blanket. A bookshelf lined with field manuals, baseball cards, and worn paperbacks. A Marine Corps flag folded inside a wooden case. Boots polished and set beside the closet as if their owner might return from a walk. On the desk sat an alarm clock, the old kind with metal bells on top, its hands fixed at 7:17. Caleb stepped inside slowly. Atlas entered beside him and went straight to the rug near the bed. He lowered himself there with a sigh so deep it seemed to come from years before. Caleb noticed a photograph propped against the lamp. Andrew, younger than Caleb expected, stood in a dusty training yard with one hand on the head of a German shepherd barely past puppyhood. On the back, written in blue pen, were the words, Andrew and Anchor, first day home. Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog's eyes were on the photograph, steady and soft. Anchor, Caleb said under his breath, testing the name. Atlas's ears moved. Not startled, recognizing. Caleb felt something inside him loosen and ache at the same time. On the wall above the desk hung a shadow box. Inside were patches, a folded note, and a dog tag that matched the one Caleb had once found buried in the files from the rescue. Except this one had not been erased by paperwork. A. Whitaker, United States Marine Corps. Beneath it, in Miriam's careful handwriting, was a small card. My son came home at 7:17 in the evening. Not the way I prayed, but wrapped in honor. Caleb closed his eyes. Now he understood. The clock was not marking an accident. It was marking the hour grief arrived at the door. For Miriam, 7:17 had become the place where time stopped. For Atlas, maybe it had become the hour to stand guard. The hour to return. The hour to make sure no one was left alone when memory came back. Caleb turned toward the desk and saw a stack of letters bound with twine. He knew he should not read them. He knew some rooms deserved silence. But on top of the stack was an envelope addressed in bold, steady handwriting. To the Marine I pulled from the dust, if they ever find him. Caleb's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt without moving. He reached for the envelope and stopped just short of touching it. Atlas rose from the rug and came to his side, pressing his shoulder against Caleb's leg. The weight of him was warm, living, certain. Caleb looked down, and for the first time since entering that house, he felt afraid of a piece of paper. Not because it might reveal something terrible, but because it might reveal grace. He picked up the letter with trembling fingers. Caleb unfolded the letter with the careful hands of a man who suddenly understood that paper could carry more weight than stone. The handwriting was steady, dark, and slightly slanted, written by someone who had expected time to be shorter than hope. He read the first line silently, but the words seemed to rise into the room anyway. If this reaches you, then you made it home. Caleb sat slowly on the edge of Andrew's bed. Atlas lowered himself at his feet, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb's face, as if the dog had waited years to watch this moment happen. The letter did not describe glory. It did not speak like a man asking to be remembered as brave. Andrew wrote about dust in his teeth, heat lifting off the road in waves, the strange quiet that falls after chaos, and a young Marine whose name he never learned, a white kid with a torn sleeve, a stubborn pulse, and a hand that would not let go of his wrist. Caleb pressed his thumb against the page. A memory stirred in him, not clear, not whole, just fragments he had carried for years without a name attached. Bright sky. Someone dragging him backward by the straps of his gear. A voice saying, "Stay with me, brother. You are not done yet." He had been told later that a Marine had pulled him out and then disappeared into the confusion of evacuation and paperwork. Caleb had searched once, then stopped when the search led nowhere. Life after service had become smaller. Survival had taken all the room where gratitude should have lived. Now the name was in front of him. Andrew Whitaker. Caleb's throat tightened until breathing felt like work. The letter continued. I do not know whether you believe in signs. I did not used to, but my dog does. Anchor knows when a heart is still fighting. He knew it with you before I did. If you are reading this, maybe it means he found his way back to someone who needed him. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd's head rested between his paws, but his eyes were open, bright in the lamplight. You were there, Caleb whispered. Atlas lifted his chin, just slightly. Caleb read the last lines through a blur he did not bother to hide. Tell my mother I was not alone. Tell her Anchor stayed with me until the end of my last good day. And if you ever meet him, do not let him become just another lost dog in another file. He was family. Caleb lowered the letter to his knees. Outside, thunder rolled far beyond the hills, softened by distance, like a memory no longer trying to hurt him. The room held still around him, filled with Andrew's books, Andrew's boots, Andrew's frozen clock, and the dog who had carried one man's love through years of strangers, shelters, new names, and silent walks beneath Oregon rain. Caleb did not know how long he sat there. He only knew that when he finally moved, Atlas rose too, pressing his shoulder into Caleb's leg with that same quiet pressure that had once kept him from falling too deep into himself. I should have known, Caleb said, though he did not know who he was apologizing to. To Andrew, to Miriam, to the dog, to the years he had spent thinking rescue was something that happened once, in one place, and then ended. He folded the letter and held it close against his chest. Downstairs, his phone buzzed with a weak signal returning. A message from the hospital appeared on the screen, short and merciful. Miriam was stable. She was asking about the dog. Caleb closed his eyes, and a breath left him that felt almost like a prayer. He placed the letter back on the desk, then paused. Beside the stack of letters was a small leather collar, old but carefully cleaned, with a brass tag hanging from the ring. Anchor. Caleb lifted it gently. Atlas stepped closer and sniffed the tag. For one sacred second, the dog seemed young again, not in body, but in memory. Caleb clipped the old collar around his own wrist like a promise, then turned off the lamp. At the doorway, he looked back at the room and spoke softly into the gold fading behind him. "He made it home, Andrew. And so did you." By the time Caleb returned to Willow Creek Road the next morning, the storm had washed the town clean. Rainwater still clung to the maple branches outside Miriam Whitaker's house, shining like small glass beads in the pale Oregon sun. The white siding looked softer in daylight, less like a secret and more like a place that had grown tired of being silent. Caleb parked at the curb and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, Atlas breathing quietly in the passenger seat beside him. The old leather collar lay across Caleb's wrist, the brass tag warm from his skin. Anchor. He had not slept much. He had spent most of the night at the hospital, waiting in the blue-white glow of the emergency room while nurses moved gently through the halls and Atlas rested at his boots like a shadow with a heartbeat. Miriam had opened her eyes near dawn. The first thing she asked was not where she was, or how long she had been there, or whether her house was locked. She asked, "Did he stay?" Caleb had looked down at Atlas and said, "Yes, ma'am." He stayed. Now Miriam needed a few days of care before coming home, and Caleb had returned to make sure the house was secure. That was what he told himself. Check the lock. Close the windows. Turn off the lamp upstairs. Practical things. Marine things. But when he stepped onto the porch, he knew the truth was quieter than that. He had come back because the house no longer felt like a stranger's house. Atlas stepped ahead of him, not pulling, not searching, simply entering with the calm certainty of someone returning to a room where his name had once been called with love. Inside, morning light fell across the floorboards. Caleb found the living room exactly as they had left it, except the fear was gone from the air. He folded the blanket he had used for Miriam. He set the cane upright by the hallway table. He washed the coffee cup in the kitchen sink, the small domestic sound of running water filling the room in a way that almost hurt. On the refrigerator were old magnets from national parks, a faded grocery list, and a photograph tucked beneath a ceramic cross. Andrew as a boy, missing one front tooth, holding a German Shepherd puppy in a red ribbon. Caleb touched the edge of the photograph. "You were smaller then," he said. Atlas sat beside him and gave one soft huff, as if unwilling to confirm or deny anything. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Then he saw the note taped beside the calendar. It was in Miriam's handwriting, shaky but clear, 7/17. Porch light on. Pray for Andrew. Caleb stood very still. Every evening, while Caleb had been walking past with a dog he thought he had rescued, Miriam had been turning on that light for a son who would not come home. And Atlas, somewhere deep beneath the name Caleb had given him, had answered it. Not with words, not with proof, with presence. Caleb took a slow breath and looked toward the stairs. He climbed to Andrew's room one more time, Atlas following close. The daylight changed everything. The room seemed less frozen now, less like grief and more like love waiting under dust. Caleb opened the curtains. Gray gold light spilled over the bed, the books, the folded flag, the old clock fixed at 7:17. He did not change the time. Some clocks were not broken. Some were memorials. On the desk, beside Andrew's letter, Caleb placed the leather collar carefully, then paused and took it back. Not yet. Miriam should be the one to hold it first. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and turned to leave. Atlas remained by the rug, looking at the photograph of Andrew. Caleb waited. "You can miss him," he said softly. "You do not have to choose." At that, the German Shepherd rose and crossed the room to Caleb. He pressed his head into Caleb's hand, firm and warm, and Caleb finally understood something he had resisted for years. Love was not replaced when it was shared. It widened. It made room. It found the next wounded soul and laid down beside it. The hospital released Miriam Whitaker 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon washed in clean sunlight. Caleb drove her home in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because some mercies are too delicate for conversation. Atlas sat in the back seat with his chin resting between the front seats, watching Miriam the way he had watched the White House all those evenings, steady, patient, afraid to blink in case she disappeared again. Miriam looked smaller outside the hospital, wrapped in a cream cardigan, her silver hair pinned neatly now, her hands folded around a paper bag of medication and discharge papers. Yet when Caleb opened the front door for her, she stopped on the porch and looked at the threshold as if it were the edge of another life. The ceramic angel still sat beside the steps, chipped wings bright under the sun. The porch light was off for the first time Caleb had ever seen. "I kept it on for him," she said quietly. Caleb did not ask who. He only nodded. Atlas stepped forward, then stopped, waiting. Miriam looked down at him, and the years moved across her face like weather over water. "Come in, Anchor," she whispered. Then she looked at Caleb, eyes wet but clear. Atlas too. The German shepherd crossed the threshold. No hesitation. No fear. His paws touched the old floorboards, and the house seemed to receive him with a silence warmer than sound. Caleb helped Miriam to the recliner in the living room, made sure her cane was within reach, set a glass of water on the side table, and checked the small list the nurse had given him. He did it all with the careful focus of a man following orders, but his heart was not in the checklist. His heart was in Miriam's hand resting on Atlas's head, in the way the dog leaned against her knee and then glanced back at Caleb as if making room for him too. Later, when the afternoon softened toward evening, Miriam asked for the collar. Caleb had carried it in his jacket pocket since the night he found it. He took it out slowly and placed it in her palms. The brass tag caught the light. Anchor. Miriam held it with both hands. For a long moment, she did not cry. She simply closed her eyes and breathed. "Andrew brought him home in a laundry basket," she said. Said the pup had more courage than common sense. Caleb sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. Atlas lay between them, eyes half closed, listening to both names that belonged to him. "He wrote about you," Caleb said. Miriam opened her eyes. Caleb reached into his pocket and unfolded the letter. He had asked himself 100 times whether to read it aloud, whether it was his right, whether grief should be touched only by its owner. But Miriam nodded before he could ask. So Caleb read. His voice was rough at first, then steadier. He read about the unknown Marine who made it home. He read about Anchor knowing when a heart was still fighting. He read the last lines slowly, the room holding each word like a candle sheltered from wind. "Tell my mother I was not alone." When Caleb finished, Miriam covered her mouth with one hand. Atlas rose and placed his head in her lap. That was when she finally broke, not loudly, not hopelessly, but with the soft surrender of someone who had carried a question for years and had just been given an answer. Caleb bowed his head. He did not interrupt. Outside, the sky turned rose over Willow Creek Road. At 7:17, the old clock upstairs began to chime. Miriam looked toward the ceiling, then at Caleb, then at the dog between them. For the first time, she did not reach for the porch light. She only whispered, "Thank you for bringing him back." Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the white walls, then at the woman whose son had saved his life before he ever knew her name. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "He brought us all back." Weeks passed, and the White House at the end of Willow Creek Road began to look less like a question and more like an answer. Caleb came by every evening after work, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with a toolbox, sometimes with nothing but Atlas and the kind of quiet that did not ask to be filled. He fixed the loose porch step where Miriam had once paused too carefully. He replaced the dim hallway bulb. He trimmed the maple branches back from the upstairs window so morning light could reach Andrew's room without fighting through shadows. Miriam protested at first, the way proud people do when kindness arrives wearing work gloves. Caleb never argued. He only smiled a little and said, "Ma'am, I am already here." Atlas settled into the rhythm as if he had designed it himself. At Caleb's house, he slept beside the bed. At Miriam's, he lay between the recliner and the front door, close enough to guard, close enough to be touched. Some evenings Miriam called him Anchor, especially when memory softened her voice. Some evenings Caleb called him Atlas, usually when the dog nudged his hand away from fixing something too late into the night. The German shepherd answered to both, because love had never confused him. Names were only doors. He knew the rooms behind them. On Sundays, Caleb drove Miriam to the small church with the cracked bell, the one he had passed so many times without entering. He did not sit near the front. He did not sing loudly. But when the congregation bowed their heads, Caleb found that silence no longer felt empty. It felt held. Afterward, people began to learn the story in pieces. Not all of it. Some things stayed inside the White House, where they belonged. But they knew enough to leave casseroles on Miriam's porch, to wave when Caleb's truck pulled up, to smile when Atlas walked by with that old shepherd dignity, carrying two histories in one loyal body. One evening near Thanksgiving, Miriam set 3 plates at the kitchen table. Caleb noticed and stopped in the doorway. "Expecting someone?" he asked gently. Miriam touched the 3rd plate, then looked toward the living room where Atlas slept with his head on his paws. "Just making room," she said. Caleb understood. The porch light still came on at 7:17, but it no longer burned like a wound. It glowed like welcome. Sometimes, when the old clock chimed upstairs, Miriam would close her eyes, Caleb would lower his gaze, and Atlas would lift his head, listening to a sound that no longer trapped them in the past. It simply reminded them that love had arrived once, left a mark, and somehow found its way back. By winter, the first snow-dusted Willow Creek rode in a soft white hush. Caleb stood on the porch beside Miriam, watching Atlas trot carefully through the yard, nose to the ground, tail moving with quiet satisfaction. The chipped ceramic angel had been repaired with a thin line of gold paint along one wing. Not hidden, not erased, made whole by the very place it had cracked. Miriam slipped Andrew's old collar into Caleb's hand. "He should carry both," she said. Caleb knelt and clipped the brass tag beside Atlas's newer one. "Anchor. Atlas." The 2 names rested together and caught the porch light. The dog looked from Miriam to Caleb, then pressed his body gently against them both. No one said anything for a while. The snow kept falling. The house stayed bright. And in that small, holy silence, Caleb finally understood that some missions do not come with orders, maps, or medals. Some come as a dog stopping at the same door, night after night, until a wounded man becomes brave enough to knock, and 3 lonely hearts discover that grace had been waiting on the porch all along.